Princess Nivera of the Zineri Empire was unlike any other being in the galaxy. She was small, delicate, with skin that shimmered like moonlight and eyes that sparkled with a wisdom far beyond her years. But despite her beauty, there was one thing that made her different from all other royals. She was untouchable. From the moment she was born, the laws of the Zineri had made it clear that no one was to lay a hand on her. Not even the most loyal of her people dared approach her with their touch. It wasn't out of respect or fear, but because of something far more dangerous. Nivera possessed a power that had never been seen in the galaxy. A power that could destroy entire worlds if it ever awakened. Her power was the reason the Zineri royal family kept her isolated. For years, she had lived in the Grand Palace, surrounded by guards, servants, and advisors. They all spoke of her with reverence, but none dared get too close. She was a symbol of strength and danger, an enigma that no one truly understood. The Zineri believed that if anyone touched her, the power within her would awaken, and the galaxy would tremble. It was a secret passed down through the generations of the royal family, a dark truth hidden from the public. But despite the warnings, Nivera often wondered if her power was as dangerous as they said. She had never felt it, not in any real way. The power was always locked away, dormant, never showing itself. But she knew it was there, just beneath the surface, waiting for something to trigger it. Her days were long and lonely, though she had everything a princess could want. Riches, luxury, and the finest education. Nivera often found herself staring out of her window, gazing at the stars beyond the palace walls. She longed for adventure, for the freedom to explore the universe, but she knew that such desires would never be fulfilled. She was the heir to the throne, and her life had already been decided for her. The palace, once a place of grandeur and beauty, now felt like a prison. Nivera spent her time reading ancient texts, studying the history of the galaxy, and learning about the many species that inhabited it. Yet, no matter how much she learned, there was one thing that always troubled her. Why was she so different from everyone else? Why was she feared? Her servants were kind but distant, always keeping the safe distance from her. The guards, though loyal, never made eye contact, as if afraid that even a glance might awaken her hidden power. The only one who seemed to treat her like a normal person was her personal maid, a young Zineri named Lyra. But even Lyra would never touch her, not even to help her with something as simple as adjusting her gown. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, casting a warm glow over the palace gardens, Nivera sat alone in her chamber, feeling more isolated than ever. She was frustrated by her situation, tired of being treated like a fragile artifact. She had never wanted to be a prisoner in her own life, but it seemed like that was all she would ever be. Just as she was about to close her eyes in frustration, a strange sound caught her attention. The faintest hum echoed through the palace corridors, followed by a soft, metallic click. Nivera's heart raced as she stood and moved toward the sound. It was unlike anything she had heard before, and it seemed to be coming from the lower levels of the palace, where only the most trusted guards and servants were allowed to go. Curious, Nivera quietly slipped out of her room, careful not to alert anyone to her presence. She moved quickly through the halls, her footsteps light on the polished floors. She had always been curious about the forbidden parts of the palace, but she knew better than to explore them. But tonight, something was different. The strange noise pulled her toward it, as if it were calling to her. As she descended deeper into the palace, the air grew colder and the light grew dimmer. The sound grew louder, now unmistakably mechanical. A ship, perhaps, or something far more dangerous. Nivera felt a chill run down her spine. She had never felt this way before. There was something here, something important, and she couldn't ignore it. At the end of the corridor, Nivera found herself standing in front of a massive door, unlike any she had seen before. It was made of metal, with intricate carvings of ancient Zineri symbols etched into its surface. The door was slightly ajar, and the noise was coming from within. Without thinking, Nivera pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. What she saw was something she could never have imagined. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing in the center of the room. The figure was tall and broad, unlike any Zaneri she had ever seen. It was human. The night was thick with silence as Princess Nivera stood frozen behind a heavy metal door, her heart racing. The figure in the room was not what she expected. He was human, his dark figure barely visible in the shadows. He moved with purpose, scanning the room, unaware of her presence. Nivera's mind raced with questions. What was a human doing here? How had he gotten into the palace? She knew she had to be careful. The Zaneri believed that humans were nothing more than troublemakers, outsiders with no place in their world. But there was something different about this one, something that intrigued her. Her curiosity overpowered her fear, and she quietly stepped forward, careful not to make a sound. The human was standing near a control panel, his hands working quickly to bypass the security systems. Nivera watched, mesmerized by his skill. She had never seen anyone work with such precision. It was as though he knew the palace's every secret. As he turned, she quickly ducked back behind the door, her pulse quickening. She couldn't let him see her, at least not yet. But her luck didn't last. The human paused, his head snapping toward the door as if he had sensed her presence. Nivera's heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, praying that he would leave. Instead, he took a step closer. "I know you're there," he said, his voice calm and steady, though she could hear the faintest hint of a smile. "I can hear your breathing." Nivera was caught. She knew she couldn't hide forever, and so, reluctantly, she stepped out from behind the door. She met his gaze, feeling both a sense of fear and something she couldn't explain. Curiosity, perhaps. The human was taller than she imagined, his dark eyes studying her with a mix of caution and calculation. She didn't know whether to run or stay. The human didn't make a move at first. Instead, he looked her over, his brow furrowing in confusion. "You're the princess, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low but sharp, like a man who had seen far too much in his life. Nivera nodded, unsure of what to say. "I am," she replied quietly, still unsure of his intentions. She had never been this close to a human before, let alone one who had managed to infiltrate the palace so easily. "I wasn't expecting this," the man muttered to himself, looking around the room as if weighing his options. Nivera couldn't help but notice the way his eyes darted between the exits, as though he was calculating his next move. But then, just as quickly, his attention returned to her. "Are you going to kill me?" Nivera asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had heard stories of humans taking drastic measures to get what they wanted, but she couldn't bring herself to believe it. Not yet. The man chuckled softly, his eyes softening a little. "No, princess, I'm not here to kill you. At least, not in the way you're thinking." Nivera raised an eyebrow, her suspicion growing. "Then why are you here? What do you want from me?" The human hesitated, clearly searching for the right words. "I'm here because I have a job," he finally said. "A job that involves getting you out of here." Nivera's mind raced. "Out of here? Why? The palace is my home." "Not for long," the human replied, his voice turning more serious. "There are people who want you, princess, dangerous people, and if they get their hands on you, things won't end well for anyone." Nivera felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that there were those who saw her as nothing more than a pawn, someone to control. But to hear it from a human, someone she didn't even know, made it feel far too real. "What do you mean, dangerous people?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She had never been afraid of much in her life, but the thought of being taken away from everything she knew, everything she had ever loved, terrified her. The human sighed, his expression hardening. "I can't tell you much right now, but there are people who want you alive, and there are others who want you dead. All I can promise is that I'm not the one trying to harm you." Nivera studied him for a long moment, her thoughts swirling. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe that this human wasn't just another threat. But something about him seemed different. He wasn't here for power or glory. There was no greed in his eyes, just a sense of purpose. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice steadying. "Elias Gray," he answered, his tone warm but guarded. "And I'm here to get you out of this palace." Before she could respond, there was a loud bang from outside the room. The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. Guards. Nivara's heart leaped into her throat. She had to decide quickly. Elias's eyes met hers with an understanding that only those who had lived through danger could have. "It's time to go," he said, offering her a hand. Nivara hesitated for only a second before stepping forward and taking his hand. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear: her life was about to change forever. The air in the palace corridors was thick with tension as Elias and Nivara moved quickly through the shadows. Her heart raced with every step, unsure of what was happening or what would happen next. But one thing was clear: this was her chance. For the first time in her life, she wasn't bound by the palace walls, and for the first time, she wasn't following the rules that had always confined her. Elias kept a steady pace, his eyes scanning every corner, every doorway. He moved like someone who had been in dangerous situations before, someone who knew what it meant to be hunted. Nivara couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as she followed him, trying to match his strides, though she had never been the most athletic. The princess had always been confined to the safety of her palace, and even the idea of running felt foreign to her. Elias glanced over his shoulder, giving her a reassuring nod. "Keep up, princess. We can't afford to stop." Nivara nodded, though she was starting to wonder if this was a mistake. She had never questioned the safety of her palace before, but now, with every step, she realized how much she had taken her protected life for granted. Outside these walls, nothing was certain. The thought of facing the world outside, of being hunted, made her stomach churn with anxiety. "Where are we going?" she whispered, not wanting to make too much noise. The palace was full of guards, and she knew that once they were discovered, there would be no turning back. Elias didn't answer right away. He seemed to be listening for something, his sharp eyes darting back and forth. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "There's a ship waiting for us. A small one, hidden near the palace grounds. It's not much, but it will get us out of here." Nivara felt a wave of relief wash over her. At least there was a plan, a way out. But she quickly reminded herself that things were rarely as simple as they seemed. Even with a ship waiting, there was still the matter of getting past the palace's security, the guards, and the countless obstacles in their way. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, cutting through the silence like a knife. Elias immediately grabbed Nivara's arm, pulling her into a small alcove. He pressed his back against the wall, his breathing slow and controlled. Nivara's pulse quickened, and she held her breath, trying to make herself as small as possible. The guards' voices grew louder as they approached. Nivara could hear them speaking in hushed tones, unaware of the two figures standing just inches away. They passed by, their footsteps fading as quickly as they had come. Elias exhaled softly, and Nivara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was close," she whispered, her voice trembling. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her body still stiff from the rush of adrenaline. "Stay close," Elias muttered, his eyes scanning the hallway once more. "We need to move fast. They'll be checking the palace soon." Nivara nodded and followed him without hesitation. The further they moved from the main hallways, the quieter the palace became. The large, open spaces gave way to narrow, dimly lit corridors. The air smelled faintly of dust, and Nivara couldn't help but notice how different everything seemed when she wasn't surrounded by her guards and servants. Her mind wandered for a moment, thinking of the people who had once been part of her world. The servants who cared for her, the guards who kept watch, and the advisors who had guided her. Were they all aware of what was happening? Were they even looking for her now? Or had they been told nothing? "What's going to happen once we leave?" Nivara asked softly, still unsure of what to expect. "What will I do out there in the galaxy? I've never been anywhere else." Elias turned to her, his face serious. "We'll figure that out when we get to the ship. The important thing is we get out of here first." Nivara nodded again, trying to ignore the wave of doubt that crept up inside her. She didn't know anything about the galaxy outside of the stories she had read. The palace had been her entire world. It was all she knew. They turned a corner, and Nivara's breath caught in her throat. Ahead of them was a large set of double doors. Entrance to the palace's private gardens. The exit to the outside world was so close, she could almost taste it. Suddenly, the doors swung open, and Nivara froze. 2 guards stood on the other side, blocking the path. Elias cursed under his breath. But before Nivara could say anything, he pushed her behind him. He quickly assessed the situation, then glanced at her over his shoulder. "I need you to stay calm," he whispered, his voice low and steady. "I'm going to distract them. When I do, you run for the gardens. You'll be safe once you're out there." Nivara's stomach flipped at the thought of running alone, but she knew there was no other choice. She had to trust him. With a swift motion, Elias stepped forward, drawing the attention of the guards. "I'm not here for a fight," he said loudly, keeping his voice firm but non-threatening. "Just let us pass, and there's no need for trouble." The guards looked at each other, clearly confused by the appearance of a human in the palace. One of them reached for his weapon, but Elias was quicker. He lunged at the guard, knocking the weapon from his hand in a single swift movement. "Go now," Elias shouted to Nivara. Without thinking, she ran. Her legs moved faster than they ever had before, her heart pounding in her chest as she sprinted toward the gardens. She could hear the guards shouting behind her, but she didn't dare look back. The cool night air hit her face as she burst through the doors and into the open space. The garden was beautiful at night, bathed in silver moonlight, but she couldn't afford to admire it now. She had to get to the ship. Nivara's breath came in quick, sharp bursts as she sprinted across the moonlit garden. She could hear the guards' voices growing fainter, but they weren't far behind. The sound of their boots striking the ground sent waves of panic through her, urging her to run faster. She glanced over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of Elias as he fought off the guards, his movements swift and precise. He was skilled, that much was clear, but Nivara had no time to wonder how he had learned to fight like that. She had to focus on the present, on getting to the ship, on escaping the palace. The garden felt vast, but every step she took felt like an eternity. The tall hedges surrounding the ground seemed endless, and the dark shadows of the trees stretched out in all directions. Nivara felt a sense of isolation that was both thrilling and terrifying. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone in the world, free to go wherever she wanted, or at least that was what she hoped. Her feet pounded against the stone pathway, the cold air nipping at her skin as she approached the edge of the garden. Ahead, she saw the dim outline of a small building, the place where the ship was hidden. It was tucked away behind the tall gates, almost as if it were a secret, and for a moment, Nivara couldn't help but wonder how Elias had found it. She pushed the thought aside and focused on the task at hand. She was so close now. The sound of footsteps drew nearer, and a flicker of movement caught her eye. One of the guards had broken away from the others and was heading straight for her. His face was set with determination, and Nivara's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't fast enough to outrun him. Her mind raced for a solution. She could try to hide in the shadows, but she was no expert at blending in. She could hear the guard's footsteps growing louder, getting closer with each passing second. Panic surged in her chest, and for a split second, she felt as though she might freeze in place. But then she remembered Elias. He had trusted her, told her to keep moving, and she would. She wasn't going to stop now. With a sudden burst of energy, she turned sharply to the left, darting between a pair of tall, looming trees. Her legs burned as she pushed herself harder, zigzagging through the garden's maze-like layout. She could hear the guard's voice behind her, calling out to his companions. They were closing in. Nivara's thoughts were racing faster than her feet. Where was Elias? Had he managed to get past the guards? She couldn't hear the sounds of fighting anymore, and for a moment, she feared the worst. But there was no time to dwell on that now. She had to get to the ship. She had to survive. She rounded another corner and finally saw it. The small, sleek ship hidden behind a stone structure. The lights were dim, but there was no mistaking the shape of the vessel. It was just as Elias had described, compact, efficient, and just big enough for the two of them to escape the palace. But as Nivara drew closer, a chill ran through her. The ship wasn't empty. Two figures stood at the entrance, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. Her heart leaped in her chest as she realized they weren't allies. They were more guards. The guards hadn't stopped. They had been waiting, anticipating her arrival. Nivara's mind spun as she tried to think of her next move. She couldn't outrun them. She didn't have the skills to fight them. But she wasn't going to give up. She couldn't. The guards noticed her, and one of them raised his weapon. "Stop right there," he called out, his voice cold and stern. "You're not going anywhere." Nivara's heart hammered in her chest. She froze, knowing she had been cornered. But just as she was about to give in to fear, a voice rang out from the shadows behind her. "Move." It was Elias. Nivara didn't hesitate. She turned quickly and sprinted toward the sound of his voice. She felt a rush of hope surge through her, and it was all she needed to push her legs faster. The guards didn't have time to react before Elias appeared, his presence like a shield, blocking the path of the guards. Without warning, Elias lunged at the first guard, catching him off guard. The second guard pulled out his weapon, but Elias was already one step ahead. He knocked the weapon from the guard's hand in a blur of motion and disarmed him before he could react. "Go," Elias shouted, his voice urgent. Nivara didn't wait. She darted past them, heading straight for the ship. Her heart raced in her chest as she reached the entrance, almost stumbling in her haste. But she caught herself, stepping into the ship with only a second to spare. The door slid shut behind her with a soft hiss, and Nivara collapsed into the seat, her legs shaking from the adrenaline of the chase. Elias was already at the controls, his face set with determination. "They're coming," he said, his voice grim. "We don't have much time." Nivara nodded, her hands still trembling as she gripped the seat. They were out, but not safe. Not yet. As the ship's engines roared to life, Nivara looked out the small viewport. The palace was far behind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't left the danger behind. There was more waiting for them, more challenges ahead. But for now, she was free. The stars streaked across the darkness as the ship rocketed into space. Nivara sat in her seat, her hands clutching the armrests, trying to calm the tremor that still ran through her body. The escape from the palace had been swift, but it hadn't been easy. They were free, at least for now, but the danger was far from over. Elias was focused on the controls, his fingers moving rapidly over the ship's interface. His sharp eyes darted between the various readouts, ensuring everything was in working order. Nivara couldn't help but notice the calmness in his demeanor. Despite everything that had happened, he was cool under pressure. It was as though nothing could faze him. She couldn't say the same for herself. Every part of her felt on edge. The flashing lights from the control panel illuminated her face, casting an eerie glow over her features. Her heart still raced, her breath coming in shallow bursts. There was no telling who would come after them next. "Where are we headed?" Nivara asked, trying to sound as calm as possible, though her voice trembled slightly. Elias didn't look at her, but his voice was steady. "We're heading to the outer rim. It's remote, less likely to be tracked." Nivara nodded, though she didn't fully understand the significance. All she knew was that they were leaving everything she'd known behind. The life she had lived, an arranged life, a life of luxury and control, was gone. She couldn't help but feel a strange mix of freedom and fear. What was out there in the vast, uncharted space? What awaited her beyond the safety of the familiar? Her eyes lingered on Elias. He was the only person she knew in this vast, new world. He had been the one to free her, the one who fought to protect her. But she couldn't help but wonder, what did he want from her? Why had he gone to such lengths to save her? Nivera was not naive. She understood that people didn't do things without a reason. She didn't know Elias's past or his motivations, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. But she also knew that, right now, he was the only person who could guide her. She had no choice but to trust him. Hours passed as the ship cruised deeper into space, its engines humming softly in the background. The stars outside the viewport seemed endless, twinkling in the infinite blackness. Nivera had always dreamed of exploring the stars, but now that she was actually here, the vastness of space was both beautiful and terrifying. Nivera turned her attention back to Elias. "Do you think they'll follow us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias paused for a moment, then met her gaze. His eyes were unreadable, but there was something in his expression that made Nivera's stomach twist. "They'll try," he said, his tone firm. "But I'll make sure they don't catch us." She wanted to believe him, but doubt lingered in the back of her mind. She had no idea what kind of enemies they were dealing with. The guards who had come after her at the palace were just a small part of a larger force, one that likely wouldn't give up easily. "What if we can't outrun them?" she asked, her voice edged with fear. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he focused on adjusting the ship's course. The tension in the air was thick, but Nivera could see that he was doing his best to remain calm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elias spoke again. "We will. Trust me." Nivera nodded, but the doubt in her mind didn't disappear. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that they were safe, but space was unpredictable, and their enemies were relentless. The ship jolted suddenly, breaking her train of thought. Nivera's heart leaped in her chest as the warning lights flashed on the control panel. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elias's hands flew over the controls, his face growing serious. "We've been detected. They found us." Nivera's breath caught in her throat. The stars outside the viewport blurred as the ship made a sharp turn, evading an incoming missile. Elias gritted his teeth and pulled hard on the ship's controls, sending it into a series of evasive maneuvers. She could feel the ship's engines straining as they pushed the limits of its speed. Nivera's heart raced as she looked at Elias, who was working tirelessly to keep them out of danger. He was calm, but she could see the beads of sweat forming on his brow. He wasn't invincible. "We need to lose them," he muttered, more to himself than to Nivera. Nivera gripped the armrest tighter, her knuckles turning white. The ship rocked violently as another missile narrowly missed them, its explosion lighting up the dark expanse of space like a star being born. "We can't outrun them forever," Nivera shouted, panic creeping into her voice. Elias didn't respond. Instead, he engaged the ship's cloaking system, and for a moment, everything fell eerily silent. The stars outside the viewport faded into nothingness, the ship blending seamlessly with the blackness of space. Nivera exhaled a shaky breath. "What now?" Elias glanced at her, his face grim. "Now we wait." The tension in the air was palpable as they drifted in silence. Nivera couldn't help but wonder how long they could stay hidden, how long they could keep running. But in that moment, all she could do was hope. Hope that Elias could keep them safe. Hope that they would survive. The silence inside the ship was deafening. Nivera sat rigidly in her seat, eyes scanning the dark void of space. Elias, sitting at the controls, was focused but tense. The cloaking device had worked for now, hiding them from their pursuers, but Nivera knew it wouldn't be enough for long. The technology they were up against was advanced. Sooner or later, their enemies would find them. A small beep sounded, and Elias glanced at the control panel. His expression hardened, and Nivera's stomach tightened in response. "They're still searching," he muttered, His eyes flicked to the ship's radar. But we have time. We're not out of danger yet. Nivera tried to steady her breath, though her mind was racing. She had never imagined her life would take such a dramatic turn. Just days ago, she had been a princess, living in a palace, surrounded by luxury and safety. Now she was on the run, in the depths of space, with an uncertain future ahead. "Where are we going, Elias?" she asked quietly, her voice unsure. He glanced at her, his face still set with determination. "There's a place, a sanctuary, a remote world, far from the reach of anyone who might be looking for us. It's our best chance." Nivera nodded, though doubt still lingered in her chest. She had to trust him. There was no other choice. Elias had gotten them this far, and as strange as it felt, she couldn't deny that he was her only hope of survival. The stars outside the viewport seemed endless, but there was something comforting about them now. She wasn't alone anymore. Elias might not be an ally she had expected, but he had proven his loyalty. And for that, she was grateful. "Do you think we'll make it there safely?" she asked after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias didn't immediately answer, his eyes scanning the radar. He tapped a few buttons, making a series of adjustments. "We will," he said firmly, but Nivera could hear the slight edge of uncertainty in his tone. "We just need to keep moving, stay one step ahead." The hours dragged on in a tense silence. Nivera's eyes kept darting to the view of space outside the ship, but there was nothing to see. Just endless stars and the dark abyss. The thought of being pursued, hunted by unknown enemies, gnawed at her mind. Finally, Elias broke the silence again. "We're almost there. Just a few more hours." Nivera's heart skipped a beat. They were so close. But even as hope swelled inside her, she knew the journey wasn't over. There were still many dangers ahead. The unknown stretched out in front of her, a maze of possibilities, both terrifying and hopeful. As the hours passed, Elias remained as focused as ever, his hands moving over the ship's controls with practiced ease. Nivera watched him in silence, feeling a strange mixture of admiration and curiosity. She still didn't know much about him. His past, his reasons for helping her, everything about him was shrouded in mystery. "What's your story, Elias?" Nivera asked suddenly, her voice quiet. He didn't look at her at first, but then he let out a deep sigh. "I'm just a guy trying to survive in a world that doesn't make sense anymore," he said, his voice low. "I used to be part of a crew, part of something bigger, but then things fell apart. And now I'm just doing what I can to get by." Nivera tilted her head, trying to understand. "What happened to your crew?" Elias' expression darkened, and for a moment, Nivera saw something in his eyes, a flicker of pain. "It doesn't matter now," he said, his voice tight. "I'm just trying to make sure that what happened to them doesn't happen to you." Nivera studied him for a long moment. She could tell he wasn't ready to share more, and she didn't want to push him. But she couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the people he had cared about, what had caused the world he knew to crumble. She wanted to know, but for now, she knew there was little point in asking. After a long silence, Elias spoke again, his tone more serious. "We're here. We've made it." Nivera's eyes widened as she stared out the viewport. Ahead of them, a small planet loomed, its surface dotted with green and brown patches. It was a beautiful sight, unlike anything she had ever seen. The planet was uncharted, far from the reach of civilization. It felt like a hidden world, untouched by the struggles and conflicts that had torn her life apart. "This is it," Elias said, his voice a mix of relief and determination. "We'll land, get supplies, and lay low for a while." Nivera nodded, feeling a sense of hope rising in her chest. They had made it, for now, at least. But she knew the danger wasn't over. She knew they would have to stay vigilant. Their enemies might not be far behind. As the ship descended toward the planet's surface, Nivera allowed herself to breathe a little easier. For the first time in what felt like forever, She felt the weight of the fear that had consumed her begin to lift. The ship touched down on the uncharted planet with a soft thud, the quiet hum of the engines slowly fading into silence. Nivara's heart raced, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from a deep, unspoken sense of relief. They had finally made it to a safe haven, a place where they could lay low, at least for a while. Elias turned off the engine and stood up, stretching his arms. He had been awake for hours, focused on keeping the ship hidden and making sure they weren't followed. Nivara, too, had been on edge, constantly glancing at the starry sky outside, waiting for the moment when danger would finally catch up to them. But now, as the last echoes of the ship's hum faded away, they were alone, at least for now. "We're here," Elias said, his voice low but satisfied. "Let's see what this place has to offer." Nivara nodded, feeling a sense of cautious optimism stir inside her. She followed Elias to the exit hatch, her feet light as she stepped down onto the soft, uneven surface of the planet. The air was cool and fresh, unlike anything she had ever experienced in the sterile, controlled environments of her home planet. The ground beneath her feet was soft with grass and moss, and the trees in the distance seemed ancient, their leaves glistening in the soft sunlight. "It's beautiful," Nivara murmured, looking around. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of peace. The dangers of the galaxy felt distant here. "It is," Elias agreed, scanning the area. "But we can't let our guard down. We'll need to find shelter and supplies first. There's no telling who else might be out here." They walked further into the dense foliage, the sounds of nature surrounding them. The air was rich with the scent of earth, and Nivara felt a deep sense of calm settle over her. The planet was quiet, peaceful even, and it was hard to believe that only days ago she had been in a struggle for her life. As they ventured deeper, Elias suddenly stopped. "Wait, this way," he said, motioning for her to follow. Nivara complied, feeling a twinge of curiosity. She trusted Elias. He had gotten them this far, but there was still a lot she didn't know about him. Where was he taking her? What was he expecting to find? After walking for a few more minutes, they came upon a hidden clearing, the trees parting to reveal a small stone structure. It looked old, perhaps centuries old, but it was intact. Vines and moss had crept up its walls, making it blend seamlessly with the surrounding wilderness. It looked like the perfect place to hide. "This is it," Elias said, looking up at the structure with a satisfied expression. "We'll stay here for a while. It's safe. I've used it before." Nivara's heart gave a slight flutter. She had no idea what kind of place they were in, but Elias had been right so far, and this hidden structure seemed to be a perfect refuge. She could only imagine the stories this place might hold. It was isolated, exactly what they needed. Together, they approached the entrance. The door creaked as Elias pushed it open, revealing a modest interior. Inside, there was a simple bed, some basic furniture, and a small fire pit in the center of the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Elias moved quickly, gathering supplies and securing the area. Nivara took a seat by the fire pit, her mind still racing, though she felt more at ease than she had in days. She looked at Elias, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You didn't have to help me," Nivara said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "You didn't have to risk everything for someone like me." Elias paused, looking at her with a calm expression. "I didn't do it for you, Nivara," he said. "I did it because no one should be forced to live in fear. And you, no matter where you're from, deserve to be free." Nivara blinked, his words sinking in. There was something about Elias, something that spoke of a quiet strength and an unspoken code of honor. He wasn't just a man trying to survive. He was someone who believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. She smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate, but they were all she had. Elias gave a slight nod before turning his attention to the fire. He didn't speak for a long time, But Nivera could sense the quiet comfort in the air. It wasn't the peace she had once known, but it was something different, something real. For the first time since her life had turned upside down, she felt like there was hope. As the fire crackled and the sun began to set outside, Nivera sat in silence, watching the shadows dance across the stone walls. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, it didn't matter. In this moment, she was safe, and with Elias by her side, she wasn't alone anymore. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new chapter.